What's up? It's your boy. It's Evie. So this is Krita, my 2026 introduction to Krita. I'm just gonna do this improv the entire way, so bear with me. So when you first open the program, you don't have a file open. You can't really like manage your UI or do much except for create a new image. So I'm gonna create a new image. So you do file new, and then uh when you have DPI, it's default 300. If you do like A5, that's gonna make like this amount of pixels by this amount of pixels. And what I like to do if I'm making a landscape mode painting, which I usually like to start with, is click this button, and that'll make it landscape. Or you can make a custom resolution like 3000 by 2000. And it will auto detect landscape or tallways. Color, I don't mess with these. You can ignore that. And then you have content. You can do stuff like set the default background color. So I'm going to make it like this very light red, so that it's not just blank white and it's easier on the eyes. And then background, I don't mess with this. I don't mess with this. And then once you create the document, you'll have a blank document and you'll have this layout. So all your tools are over here. What I like to do is once you have a document open, you can mess with your UI. So I'll make this part kind of wide, and then I'll go to tool options up here. And then I will undock that with this button, float the docker, and then now it's undocked. I'm going to drag it down here to this corner, and then I'm going to move it over here. And then I'm going to, because it's brush settings, it's tool options, so options for each tool. So you have fill settings, you have your magic wand settings, you have your selection lasso settings, you have your brush settings. For brush settings, you have raw input by default, and the default brush is this this is the brush button. So it's like this opacity brush. So what the first thing you want to do besides that, I close the brush presets window because I don't ever use that. And then this is my UI basically for how I do everything. And then you go into brushes, you select all, and I have some custom brushes in here, but you can just ignore those. The ones you want to dock, actually you go to favorites, and then you can see your favorites. And then I will remove a few. So like, okay, so let's remove all these. So I can show you how to add them. And a lot of these are custom, but okay, so if I was gonna go with stock brushes, I would go to all, and I'm using my mouse right now because it's easier. And then you want this big block eraser, that's like the round eraser, that's your eraser. You can make any brush bigger by holding shift and clicking and dragging to the right, and you can make it smaller by holding shift and clicking and dragging to the left. You can also make it bigger or smaller with open bracket or close bracket on the keyboard, or you can make it smaller by dragging this thing up here, and you can mess with opacity and stuff. So I'm going to add this to favorites, assign to tag favorites, and then the airbrush, you probably want to use that for shading or whatever, assign to tag favorites. The opaque brush with pressure sensitivity, assigned to tag favorites. This brush I like to use for hair and stuff, assigned to tag favorites. And then one of the soft airbrushes, like the softer airbrush, is good for shading too, assigned to tag favorites. Pencil's good for sketching. I like the dark pencil, assigned to tag favorites. And you might want like a marker brush. So see, like, okay, so the black adds pixels, like addition, and then the purple like blends, kind of like watercolor or kind of like a paint. And then the light blue or the blue is like watercolor effects. And then the white is like a blur. So I'm going to take the blur brush, assign the tag favorites, because that's like your circular blur brush for shading and stuff. And that will give you, if you go into favorites, you can see all your favorites. That's a pretty sane starting point. And then when you right click, and I like to bind this to a mouse button, right click. I mean, I like to bind this to a pin button is right click. So my top pin button is right click. And when I click it, you'll see this window here. And you have all your favorite brushes. If you click one, it switches to it. And then if you right click, you can also change the color. Well, I don't use that. I use this over here. You can also assign layer tags and stuff like that, but I don't use that. I just use it to switch brushes. So I'm going to switch to this pencil brush, and I'm going to zoom in to 100%. And I'm going to go to brush smoothing. This is very important as your stabilizer. If your hands shake, you want a stabilizer. Or if you just want a stabilizer, or you're used to a stabilizer, you use a stabilizer. So I don't mess with weighted. I use basic if I want raw input, like for erasing or for coloring sometimes, but basic is your raw input and none is like ultra raw input where it'll like detect the jaggies that the tablet picks up. So you want at least basic, which is like you can't feel it or notice it, but it does smooth out a tiny bit. And then stabilizer is the main one. I never use weighted stabilizer. And when you switch to stabilizer for the first time, you want to uncheck delay and then leave these. So just uncheck delay. Delay is bad. And then you'll notice you have a stabilizer. And I like to crank mine way the fuck up because I have really shaky hands. And now I can, you know, have a stabilizer so my lines are clean and confident looking. So let's say, oh yeah, over here you have your layers. So let's say you have this circle and you want to fill inside the circle. So if you switch to the fill tool, which is F, you'll notice that it has a threshold. I like to lower that down a little bit. And then a grow, which I like to raise to at least a couple pixels. Maybe 3 pixels, and then I'll feather 1, and then I'll enable anti-aliasing. But if you fill on the line art layer, you notice, well, I'm going to take this blue color, you notice it kind of goes over the line art layer. So what you want to do is you want to go under the line art layer, and then in the fill options, you click this button to sample from all layers, and this button is to sample from only that layer, and this button is to sample from layers that you have labeled as a color. So when you right click on a layer, you have the option to label it as a color. So that's useful for like in case you want to fill only certain layers, or you want to only sample from certain layers, but let's just do all layers for now. And then I'll fill under, and you'll notice it fills all the way, and it doesn't have the white edges because I've added a grow of 3, so it's growing 3 pixels into the line art, which is what you want. Another thing you want to do that to is the magic wand tool. So if I magic wand, I want to pick this color. It's going to select only the layer, or you want it to select from all layers. So you can mess around with the colors, but you can set it to grow the magic wand. So I'll set that to grow by like 2. And then you kind of have your magic wand. That's useful. And then another useful thing is, let's say you have like a bump on the circle. Pretend that's like a bump, like a bullet shaped bump. And then let's say if you want to or it's not magic wand, if you want to lasso select, you can lasso select the bullet, like indentation. And then I go to the brush tool, I take a airbrush and take a darker color. make it a little bit smaller, and you can kind of do that. But, like that's a shading technique, and that looks kind of cool. Of course, I drew that line on the line art, so I mean I drew that line on the on the color line. So if I you can also do polygonal selection, which is like probably easier. Do 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 do. And then if you hold Alt, this will remove from your selection. And then if you hold Shift, this will add to your selection while selecting. So I'm gonna go back to this. And there we go. That's how you can shade indentations. So what else? Right, we have enclose and fill. So like, let's say if I delete if I delete or if I hide the color layer and then I add a layer, if you want to enclose and fill, you pick the enclose and fill tool. And this is a good way to get your like base colors, base flat colors really fast instead of coloring the whole thing manually. I use enclose and fill. And you want to make sure there's no gaps because unlike Clip Studio, there's no close gaps option for this. So I set it to threshold 1, and then you want to grow to like -2 or -1, and then maybe feather 1, and then anti-aliasing. And then when you grow to -2 and then you select, you draw a circle around whatever it is you want to enclose and fill like this. It's very simple. It's just a circle. It's gonna enclose and fill, but actually you want, because it's only sampling from the blank layer, so you want it to sample from all layers. So I will enclose and fill this. And as you can see, it encloses and fills that, as you can see. The other thing is the move tool. You can move, or you can select multiple layers, which you couldn't before, and you can move multiple layers by shift clicking or control clicking multiple layers. You can resize, transform with this button, can skew, can scale, hold shift to maintain aspect ratio. But yeah, what else? Let's say, yeah, that's the main thing with layers. Let's say you have like this square and you want to shade it so you can make a layer on top. And unlike other programs, in order for the clipping mask to work, you want to select both layers, right click, group, quick group. You want to have them in a group. And then you can have the clipping mask. If you're shading with like a purple multiply, like you set this and you set this layer mode to multiply, and then you can kind of have like, as you can see, it doesn't paint outside of the, but if I tick that button right there, that will clip it onto the layer below, but it has to be in a folder in order to clip it, for shading and highlighting, and then you can make another layer, and you can do layer mode. It's under light and hard light, I guess, is a common one people use. Where is it? Hard light. Hard light. There it is, hard light. You can actually check that. So it goes into up here. Hard light. And what hard light does is any color over middle value will lighten it. and any color below middle value will darken it. So let's clip that. Kind of have that. And then you can make it like yellow maybe. What else? You can flip the canvas with V key, or was it M key? Sorry, not V, it's M key to flip the canvas. That's a common thing to check if your artist symmetrical or whatever. M is flip canvas temporarily. It doesn't actually flip the file, it just shows you the reverse view. And then if you have a brush and you've changed it all around and you want it to go back to defaults, you just press, I think it's this button right here, reload original preset. And then these are brush blending modes right here, which I don't mess with. I just leave them on normal usually. If I want blending modes, I use a layer blending mode. That's just how my workflow is. These are color pickers, so you can pick colors, but this is the color picker right here, this thing that I use right here all the time. But this is like your foreground color and your background color. And if you want a gradient, there's like a gradient tool, right? But by default, it's like foreground to transparent, but if you can make it foreground to background, which is a common thing to do, and then like make a red color of the background, and then you can kind of use the gradient tool. Of course, I want to clip that layer because it's in the folder, so I can clip it. And then if you want to drag a layer outside of the folder, you just drag it so it makes that line outside of the folder, and then it will be outside of the folder. You can also close the folder. You can rename the folder by right-clicking, rename, or edit, or properties. Go into properties, you can rename it box or whatever. And then you can rename layers, properties. But yeah, what else? You can change the opacity of the layer group or the layer. Say like I want this to be like that. 56% opacity for the gradient. And then maybe I want the lighting or I want the shading to be like a little bit less intense. I would lower the opacity. Let me think for a second. Let me see. The vector tools I don't really want to go over because I don't really like the way Krita handles vectors, but technically you can do them. And then the text tool is kind of rudimentary, but it works. Like if you want to enter text, you click the text tool and then you draw a box. And then you have this like text, placeholder text. You can highlight it and then change the size of it. And then change the color to like black. And then save. Every time you save, maybe that's a little bit too big. Every time you save, it's going to change it, as you can see, and that creates a vector text layer. And that window, when you minimize it, goes down here. You can close that. And then you can move it around. One thing you might want to do is create like a white background for your text. So what you want to do is you want to right click the vector layer for text and do, where is it, convert to paint layer. And then you can do select opaque add, and that will select it, and then select grow selection, and then you can grow it by like 6. And also, if your canvas rotates when you press the number keys, remember that you can press Control open bracket and Control close bracket to rotate right or left. So that's annoying that the number keys do that. That's editable in settings. You go to configure Krita, and then you go to shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts. You can search and edit whatever you want in here. By default, the plus key is to zoom in and the minus key is to zoom out. But yeah, we have this like selection here, so I'm going to make a layer underneath the rasterized vector layer, and then I'm going to make it white. And then I'm going to do, in the fill bucket, you have this button, which is magic wand mode. So that will only fill like what it can reach at. But if you do fill entire selection, then it'll fill the entire selection, as you can see. There you go. Just make sure you set it back when you're done. And then Control Shift A is deselect. And then Control A is select all. Control Shift A, deselect. You can select with these tools, like here's box select, here's circle select, here's polygonal select, and here's lasso select. Magic wand, and then I don't ever mess with these, but they're like the more Photoshop-y selection stuff. And then this is the zoom tool. I never use that. I just use plus and minus on the keyboard. And then the hand tool is, of course, to pan the canvas. And I think that's about it. Feel free to like rewatch this or whatever as many times as you want. Feel free to slow it down if I've been going way too fast. Feel free to do whatever. I'm gonna put this on YouTube for anyone trying to figure out krita. It's pretty basic for, this is just for doing art, like pieces. This video has explained everything you need to do like art pieces, but if you were doing like animation, of course you would use like, you would go to settings, Dockers, and then you would enable the animation stuff and do all that. But there's a lot of videos that explain animating in krita a lot better than I could, but this is just for like single art pieces. All right, peace out.